Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Susannah Heschel, the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Professor Heschel's scholarship as a historian of religion has taken her in many directions, including feminist theology, Jewish-Christian relations in 19th century Germany, the history of biblical scholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. Professor Heschel's numerous publications include the monographs Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, and the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany, as well as the edited volumes On Being a Jewish Feminist and Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, a selection of essays written by her father, the renowned Rabbi, theologian, and civil rights leader Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel gave the Oregon Humanities Center's 2014-2015 Tzedek Lectures. On January 28, 2015, she spoke on ethical challenges of scholarship in Eugene. The following day, she gave a talk titled Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, The Life and Legacy of Abraham Joshua Heschel at the UO in Portland. Her talks were part of the Connection series. Thank you, Susannah, for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Tell us about your trajectory coming to be a scholar of Jewish history. How did you get to that topic? How did you wind up there?
Well, it was actually in part what you mentioned earlier. My father was involved in the civil rights movement, and he inspired me. Martin Luther King inspired me with the love of the Bible, and especially the prophets. And so actually when I was an undergraduate, I decided I would go into biblical studies. The problem I had was with the scholarship in the field of biblical studies. So much of that European scholarship was tinged with an anti-Judaism, with Lutheran biases, and so I wanted to develop primarily in Germany and Scandinavia, with a bit in Britain as well. So then I decided, well, I really couldn't do biblical studies. The scholars were asking the wrong kinds of questions, ridiculous questions. And instead I wanted to do some work on the history of biblical scholarship, essentially the pathology of the scholarship, why they approach the Bible the way they do, and how things have gotten so twisted and wrong questions and so on. So that's when I turned to 19th century scholarship.
Why did you turn to 19th century scholarship?
So 19th century is when biblical scholarship began. That's actually when the field of theology professionalized itself in Germany. Of course, Germany was the center for such things. And in fact, German universities, until the middle of the 19th century, half the students were enrolled in theology, which is remarkable. You know, the other half in all the other subjects, medicine and law, et cetera, et cetera. So the field was booming, might say. And I wanted to understand what had happened. And my interest was not simply in what Christians had to say about Jews, Judaism, and the Bible, but I was interested in what Jews had to say about Christianity. And at the time that I proposed this as a dissertation topic, people were surprised. I never thought about that. It was always Christians looking at Judaism. So it seemed to many people to be unusual.
So what did you discover?
So what did I discover? Well, let me just give you an example. You know the painting Olympia by Manet?
Sure.
With the, yeah, that was displayed in 1863 with tremendous controversy. There's a naked woman lying, and instead of looking down, being ashamed of being naked, and she's presumably a prostitute, instead of being ashamed, she's looking straight out at the viewer, big eyes. That was a scandal. And you know, it occurred to me that this was why Christians were so upset when Jews started writing about Christianity and writing about Jesus. They were, in a sense, putting Christianity under the Jewish gaze. And that was the problem.
Fascinating.
So since you mentioned that I had an interest also in feminist theology, feminist theory helped me understand Jewish experience. Because feminists are always talking about men being in control of everything, the male hegemony, and how women can cope with it in various ways, subtly or directly. Jews had the same problem. In 19th century Germany, in the field of scholarship, Christians were in control. Christians controlled the theological faculties. There's no such thing as Jewish studies in the 19th century, as you know, in German universities. So now there was a question of Jews trying to do something about this Christian hegemony, subtly or directly. So feminist theory helped me understand the politics of Jewish-Christian relations in biblical scholarship.
So your first book is on Abraham Geiger. Who is he, and why is he the guy that you decided to write that first book about?
So Abraham Geiger lived from 1810 to 1874, and I must tell you that I'm in love with him. I thought he was the most wonderful person, and I say that because I read the diaries and the letters of quite a few different scholars of that period, and I actually thought about comparing Geiger with some others. But you know, Geiger's private letters were so wonderful. He's such a kind, warm, and optimistic person. So he was a great scholar. He was brilliant, incredibly brilliant. He went to university and he first wrote a book on the Quran. And it was the book that launched the field of Islamic studies. Amazing. He was 23 years old and he showed the parallels between teachings of the Quran, passages in the Quran, and passages in rabbinic literature. And everybody was astonished because no scholar of Islam had ever thought to compare Islam to Judaism. Then he went on. Of course, he couldn't get a job in Germany as a professor because Jewish professors, you couldn't unless you got baptized. So he worked as a rabbi, and he did a scholarship on the side, and he produced amazing work, fascinating work, rethinking Judaism and antiquity, and as a consequence, rethinking the origins of Christianity within Judaism. First century Palestine, after all, was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. In fact, Jesus is called a rabbi in the Gospels. But when Christians read what Geiger said, that Jesus was Jewish, teaching Jewish ideas, that Jesus was a rabbi like Hillel, that Jesus taught what the other rabbis were teaching, well, the Christians didn't like that at all. In fact, one of them, whose name was Franz Delitzsch, had a reputation for being philo-Semitic, liking Jews. Why did he like Jews? Because he said it was all right for them to convert and become Christians. So it's not really liking somebody, but okay. So Franz Delitzsch wrote a reply to Geiger, and he said, calling Jesus a rabbi is, to my mind, 10 times more horrific than the crucifixion. You see how strong it was. See how people reacted in horror. Christians reacted in horror at the idea of that Jesus was a rabbi, as it says in the Gospels. So that gives you a sense of the politics of the era, the politics within scholarship.
So your first book is on this incredibly important figure in history, a brilliant scholar, but someone whose findings are extremely provocative. Your next book, so the first book is on the Jewish Jesus. The next book is on the Aryan Jesus. The Aryan Jesus. What is the Aryan Jesus? Tell me what that is. Tell us about that book.
The Aryan Jesus. So you see, here's Geiger saying that Jesus was Jewish, that he's a Pharisee, that he's a rabbi, and so on. Fine. Christians didn't like that. They didn't like it because they wanted Jesus to be different, to be unique and original. But on the other hand, they knew that they had to explore Jesus from a historical point of view. What do historians do? They contextualize. So if they're going to contextualize the historical figure of Jesus, then it's first century Palestine. They're going to have to compare him to the other rabbis, other Jews of the day. Well, they didn't like it. They didn't like the comparison. They were struggling to find some way to preserve Jesus' difference from Judaism. Some of them came up with the idea of using racial theory. So racial theory was beginning to infiltrate the academy in the 19th century, in Europe in general, not just in Germany. So some theologians came up with the idea of saying, well, it may be that what Jesus said was similar to what other Jews said, but racially, he wasn't a Jew. Racially, he was an Aryan, whatever that means. What's an Aryan? An Aryan basically means you're a white German. There was even a novel that said Jesus was born in Schleswig-Holstein, which is up in the north of Germany. I mean, crazy things. But they wanted to say that Jesus wasn't Jewish, that his origins came out of Iran or out of India, out of Iraq, you know. They said that he wasn't really born in Bethlehem, which is near Jerusalem, but instead he was born in another village up in the north, another Bethlehem in the Galilee. And anyway, he's called Jesus of Nazareth, and Nazareth is in the Galilee. And then they said, well, the Galilee, you see, isn't a Jewish area at all. And in fact, it's an Aryan area. So Jesus, now, why does this become a problem? I mean, as you can say, it's nonsense. It becomes a problem, and what I looked at was this. Not only did they say Jesus was an Aryan, which means he was German, they were trying to say. They were saying that when Hitler came to power, that Hitler was doing what Jesus wanted. Jesus wanted to destroy Judaism, and that's what Hitler was doing. So Hitler was a good Christian, so to speak. That's what they were saying. And in fact, they wanted to de-Judaize Christianity entirely. They threw the Old Testament out of the Christian Bible. It's a Jewish book. We don't want it. and Jesus is an Aryan. They took the Hebrew words out of the hymnal, words like hallelujah, for example. And they wrote a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda, and I discovered archival material that demonstrated who was involved, the amount of money they spent, how productive they were during the Second World War, and really how wicked, how evil they were, and the fact that they kept their careers after World War II in East Germany, West Germany, as pastors, as theologians, as professors of theology, important figures in the church. It was never investigated.
Tell us about your research on that book, because it's an amazing story. Where did you go? What did you have to do? What was the experience like?
Well, I found some of the documents that they had published during World War II, and I wondered what were theologians in Germany saying during the war. You know, it was hard to get paper, so what did they say? And it was sheer anti-Semitic propaganda, horrible stuff. I wondered where did it come from? So I went around to different archives in Germany that had the documents, the paperwork from the era of the Third Reich. And most people said to me, oh, we don't really have anything, there's nothing. I went to archives in Berlin, and I also went to Thuringia, which is in the geographic center of Germany. It's part of the former East Germany. I showed up at the church archives in Eisenach, and they were amazed. They had never before met an American. They had never before met a Jew, and I had the first laptop they had ever seen. This was in the 90s. Anyway, they didn't like the project. Nobody liked hearing that you wanted to write something about Nazis, certainly. They said, well, we don't really have anything. They gave me a few papers. And I went back a year later, and again, a few papers. And you know, each time I went back, year after year, I would have to get a grant, and it was difficult to travel, and I was a professor already in the United States. And finally, after several years, they said, well, actually, we have everything you need. So they did, and I was able to collect material there, and I also traveled, and everywhere I went in Germany, even to tiny little towns in the north, I went to university archives in Heidelberg and Jena. The only place I had a problem was University of Vienna, where they wouldn't show me anything. At any rate, the people were very hesitant to admit, and I wanted to say, why do you hide this? These people were Nazis, you aren't, let's write about it, that's it, let's face the history. At any rate, I had to collect material, and it took a long time, and then I had to piece it together. It's kind of a detective work.
How was that book received in Germany? It's been translated into German, has it not?
No, it hasn't been translated into German.
No. Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Huh. So when I first asked you about Geiger, you said you mentioned his first book on Islam. Tell us about your new project.
So I'm very fortunate that I now have a Guggenheim Fellowship, and so I have a sabbatical, and I'm working on a book on the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam. Geiger started it, but it was continued generation after generation from the 1830s through the 1930s. Jews flocked to the study of Islam at German universities and elsewhere in Europe as well. And they wrote often about parallels between Islam and Judaism. They showed very distinct parallels between rabbinic commentaries on the Bible and how the Quran reads the Bible. So that's the history that I'm tracing. I'm interested in why they were so enthusiastic and so fascinated with Islam. For example, there were Jews who translated the Quran into German, into French, into Hebrew. This is in the middle of the 19th century. That's remarkable. Jews were building synagogues and Moorish architecture. The image of Islam they had was an image. Islam for them was a religion that was tolerant, that has strict monotheism, like Judaism, that had a religious law, rejected any images of God, any anthropomorphism. And so they painted an ideal picture. They used to refer to Islam as ethical monotheism. And that's the same expression they used to describe Judaism, both religions of ethical monotheism. Now, all of this fell apart when Hitler came to power. All the Jewish professors of Islam and Arabic at German universities lost their jobs. They had to emigrate. So that whole field came basically to an end. Some of them managed to move to other countries and continue their work. But that tradition is over, and it really was quite exceptional.
You have this amazing gift for these historical projects which recover these mind-blowing parts of history that we've just completely forgotten. I mean, both of these stories you tell about the Aryan Jesus and about the Jewish scholarship on Islam, these things just don't seem to fit our categories. I know Your talk tonight is called The Ethical Challenges of Scholarship. For you, is there an ethical dimension to this kind of your interest in these particular kinds of projects? I mean, it seems to me that there are significant ethical implications for the kind of work that you do. You want to say something about that?
Well, one of the questions that I ask myself is, to what extent are we thinking as scholars in ethical categories versus political categories? What's the difference between politics and ethics, actually? Very often people feel strongly that their politics are rooted in moral values. I'm not always convinced, and I think it's something that we should ask ourselves over and over again, question ourselves. So what are the ethical challenges? Well, I certainly felt when I became involved in feminist work when I was in graduate school that women are excluded, and that's not right. We're getting only half the story. I felt the same way with Jewish history, so I wrote about Abraham Geiger. How can you write about the history of what's called the quest for the historical Jesus? How can you write about 19th century theology and ignore this man, Abraham Geiger, who was so widely read by Protestant theologians, whether they liked him or didn't like him, but they were reacting to him. And he's very much a part of the story. So to ignore him, to omit that aspect of the story, that I find actually not only bad scholarship, but I find it unethical. Of course, writing about Nazis, that was very hard. My father lived in Nazi Germany. My father went to Berlin in 1927 to study at the university. He finished his dissertation. Hitler came to power. Eventually, he was deported in 1938. He came to this country at the last moment in 1940. To some extent, my work on these Nazi theologians was motivated by a desire to know what happened, what was it like in Nazi Germany. Some of these theologians were people that my father knew. He had studied with them. He even, I found, had letters from some of them. And so it was a way of perhaps trying to taste a bit of what he had experienced. That was part of it. And I grew up, my father was a professor, and I grew up surrounded by European Jewish refugee scholars, and they always talked about it. Look at how could Heidegger be a Nazi? Alfred Bäumler, so many, one after another, these people were mentioned at the dinner table with shock and horror. And so yes, I wanted to expose it. And I guess part of it was I was angry. I was angry that these theologians had done this, and I was terribly disturbed. How can you go from someone like Abraham Geiger, who wants to build bridges to Christians, and then look what they're saying, that Hitler is doing what Jesus wanted? What kind of a perversion of Christianity is this? A perversion of religion. And the fact is, you know, if you pervert one religion, all religions fall into shame. It's not good for any. So that's what motivated that project.
So you've just been talking about your growing up with your father. Moral grandeur and spiritual audacity is a phrase you employ to describe him. Tell us about Abraham Joshua Heschel. Who was he? You've started to say, but say something more about him. We discovered today when we were walking outside the library at the University of Oregon that there's a quotation from your father there. Tell us about your father.
So my father was born in Warsaw in 1907. He was the son of a long line of very distinguished Hasidic Rebbes. So he was surrounded by very pious Jews, a very pious, religious, and very learned, scholarly atmosphere. He used to say he grew up surrounded by people of religious nobility, which I think is a wonderful phrase, religious nobility. He went to the University of Berlin to study. He wrote a dissertation on the prophets. And in fact, it was a dissertation that challenged the way prophecy was understood by biblical scholars. He also worked on medieval Jewish philosophy. He wrote a biography of Maimonides in 1935. And then he came to the United States. He barely knew English. He was teaching at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati for 5 years. They had actually gotten him the visa and plucked him out of Nazi Europe. And then he moved to New York. He married my mother, who was a concert pianist, and they had one child. And after marrying my mother, he wrote one book after another, books that have become very important for the understanding of religion, religious experience, for Jews, but also for people around the world. In fact, I had a note from an email from a professor of Islamic theology in Pakistan, in Islamabad, saying that he's translating my father into Urdu, which I think is remarkable. So he wrote books, God in Search of Man, Man is Not Alone, Man's Quest for God, The Sabbath, The Earth is the Lord's. He revised his doctoral dissertation on the prophets into a large book, but he also was involved politically. So my father met Martin Luther King at a conference in Chicago in 1963. It was a conference on religion and race, which he said were two words that should never be uttered in the same breath. And he spoke with great passion against racism. My father knew something about racism from his own experience, felt anti-Semitism in Poland, and he was in Nazi Germany. And he and Dr. King suddenly became very close friends at that first meeting. And my father brought Dr. King to speak to Jewish groups, and also they collaborated in the movement against the war in Vietnam. My father was also involved in the Second Vatican Council in its deliberations to formulate a new statement by the Church about its relationship to the Jewish people. He went to Rome frequently, and he met with Pope Paul VI. He was involved in the anti-war movement and the movement to free Soviet Jewry. Earlier in the 50s, he spoke out against the Korean War, for example. He used to demonstrate during World War II with other rabbis, trying to urge the United States government to help rescue more Jews from Europe. So he was a scholar, a theologian, he wrote poetry, and he was a political activist.
You've characterized your father as an iconoclast. In what way was he an iconoclast?
My father was an iconoclast because, first of all, he didn't fit certain categories. He was always challenging us, which is what an intellectual should do. So he challenged biblical scholars who were saying, for example, that the prophets, well, they were, some people said they were epileptics. They used to say that about Muhammad too, by the way. They were epileptics, it was just ecstasy, they were lost consciousness, all of that kind of thing. And he said, no, you have to look at the prophetic experience and take it seriously. And in fact, he said, religion itself can't be translated into the terms of sociology or psychology, etc. It's not about function. Let's look at religion on its own terms. What is it saying? What does it mean to be a person of faith? What is holiness? How do religious people experience? He was very interested in subjective experience and in relationship, but very much, he said, if you want to know God, sharpen your sense of the human. So he was also very concerned about us as human beings and our ability that is sometimes thwarted to experience new dimensions of our own humanity, to have experiences of awe and wonder and radical amazement. He felt that too many academics worry about how humans are like animals. Well, what's unique about human beings? What are the ideals of human beings? How can we elevate our image of human beings? Those were some of his issues.
You alluded to all the relationships and collaborations that he had with people of other faiths. Why was that such an important part of his view of what a rabbi should do, what a religious leader should do? Why is it important to go talk to the Pope? Why was that important in his view?
People criticized my father and said, we're Jews, you said. After all that Christians have done to Jews, you shouldn't go to the Pope. If the Pope wants to talk to you, let him come to you. That kind of thing. My father said, if it can possibly save one life, of course I will go to Rome. So my father felt very strongly that it's important also for him in this day and age, after all that happened, after the catastrophe, that he needed to talk to Christians. My father felt, he was expected to be a Hasidic Rebbe, which would have been very insular life. And instead he felt, that's not what the world needs from me right now. And that was something he felt very strongly about, that we have to ask ourselves, why have we been given life? It's a mandate. It's not just a gift. So what should we do? What's our responsibility? And he felt he needed to do something after this terrible war, after 6 million Jews were killed. What can he do to change the way Jews are viewed, to improve relations with other religious faiths?
The phrase that you used to describe him is moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Say a little bit more about why those are the phrases he uses to describe him.
Well, I found a telegram that my father sent to President John F. Kennedy in June of 1963. President Kennedy invited religious leaders to come to the White House to have a conference about civil rights. And my father said, you have to demand more than just pretty words from religious leaders. You should tell them it's a moral emergency what's going on in the way African Americans are treated in the United States. He said you should ask religious leaders to donate a month's salary toward a fund for housing and education for African Americans. He said he said civil rights is like the weather. Everybody talks about it, nobody does anything about it. But he ended the telegram by saying the hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. And that was the phrase I used as the title of the book of essays of his that I edited. I think it's a magnificent phrase, and I think it applies to him as well. He was very courageous and he was audacious. How many people write to the President of the United States and say, tell the religious leaders to donate a month of their salary toward a fund for housing and education for African Americans, which wouldn't be a bad idea to this day, actually. And I would demand, well,
go ahead. No, say.
I wouldn't just leave it to the religious leaders either. I think that, yeah, there are other professions in the United States that would do well to donate a month of their salary also.
So you've described his being animated by a sense of moral conviction, a kind of sense of moral courage, that when in the face of injustice, action must be taken, protest must be lodged. You're a young Jewish woman growing up. You're interested in your faith. The theological seminary in New York City does not allow women to become rabbis. Tell us what you did at that time in your life. Tell us about yourself as a Jewish feminist, your own sense of political and moral obligation in relation to your faith. Say something about that aspect of your life.
So I grew up hearing my father talk about the importance of prayer, of study, the synagogue, and how people should be involved and pray with real devotion. And yet I found myself in the synagogue in the women's section where there wasn't really much prayer going on. There was a bit of chattering, and I felt alienated. I was upset that when I went with my parents to visit my uncle, who was a Hasidic Rebbe, all the men went into one room and my uncle would teach them and talk. And I was in the kitchen where I actually couldn't do very much. I was a child, and I complained to my father, and my father said, you know, you're right, things have to change. And he supported me always. I wanted to have a bat mitzvah, and he supported me. And we organized something. In those days, I don't know, in some ways, sometimes I joke, I was raised in the Middle Ages. You know, we wore white gloves to the synagogue, and things were rather formal. So it never occurred to me to ask to read from the Torah. But I did chant the Haftorah, and I gave 2 little speeches in the synagogue. And that was very big for me.
So I'm sorry to say we've run out of time.
Okay.
I wish that we could keep talking. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure.
I've been speaking with Susannah Heschel, the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. She gave the Oregon Humanities Center's 2014-15 SEDEC lectures. On January 28, 2015, she spoke on ethical challenges of scholarship in Eugene. The following day, she gave a talk titled Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, The Life and Legacy of Abraham Joshua Heschel at the UO in Portland. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again for talking to us.
My pleasure.